The widow peddled her only butter churn. A rancher sent it back full of fresh cream. I didn't set out to help anybody that October. Wasn't that kind of a season for me. The last of the hay was baled and the barn roof had been patched twice already and was going to need a third pass before the real cold arrived. And I had one hand down with a broken collarbone and the other one threatening to quit for winter work in Abilene. I was 59 years old that fall, which don't feel like much when you're 30, but when you've been sleeping on a bad mattress for 6 of those years, and pulling fence wire every spring, it adds up in a man's joints in ways he can't quite explain to someone who hasn't done it. The name's Virgil Crane. I ran the broken axle spread about 8 miles north of Millhaven on the Cimarron side. Not a big outfit, not a small one. Big enough that I couldn't just leave and small enough that I couldn't afford to stay. That's always been my life's kind of arithmetic. My wife Clara passed in the winter of '77, and I'll tell you plain, I don't talk about it much, and I won't talk about it much now. What I'll say is that when a woman has been beside you for 23 years, and then the bed goes quiet and the kitchen goes dark every morning, a man rebuilds himself around the edges of that space in whatever way he can manage. Some men drink. Some sell out and go somewhere with no memory in it. I stayed and I worked, and that was my answer to the thing. Not a good answer maybe, but mine. By the time that October rolled around, I'd gotten efficient at being alone. I kept the house a certain way, made my coffee a certain way, walked the property at the same hour most evenings. Wasn't happy. Wasn't unhappy either, or at least I'd talked myself into believing the difference between those two things didn't much matter at my stage of things. The first time I saw Nora Alcott, she was on the road that cuts through the south corner of my spread, driving a wagon that should have been retired 5 years prior. One horse, a gray that was doing its honest best but had the look of a creature that had been asked too much for too long. There was a butter churn lashed to the wagon bed, the big kind, salt-glazed ceramic, the kind a family saves up for over a couple of winters. She had it roped down careful, like it was the most important thing she owned. It might have been. I was mending a section of fence maybe 30 yards off the road when she came along, and I watched her the way a man watches things when he's not thinking about watching them. She was maybe 45. Could have been younger, hard country age as a person. Dark hair going gray at the front. Wore it pinned, and one pin had come loose and she kept reaching up and pressing it back as she drove. She held the reins with both hands, straight-backed, the way a woman holds herself when she's decided not to let the road or the day or whatever's waiting in town see her bend. She didn't look at me as she passed, just kept her eyes on the road. I went back to my fence. I found out what she was doing in Millhaven that same afternoon, when I went in for a box of 10-penny nails, and Harold Meacham, behind the hardware counter, told me, the way Harold told everybody everything, that the Alcott widow had come in trying to sell her butter churn to the general store on consignment. Alcott? I placed the name after a moment. Her husband had been Del Alcott, who ran a modest sheep operation about 4 miles east of my eastern fence line. We hadn't known each other well. Sheep and cattle don't naturally put their operators in the same rooms, but I'd seen him a few times at county meetings, and he'd seemed like a decent enough man, careful with money, careful with his handshakes. He'd died the prior February, some kind of infection from a cut gone bad. Happens out here, and it shouldn't anymore, but it does. They had no children. That was what Harold said, without me asking. No children, and the sheep operation had apparently been struggling since the previous summer, and now in October she was in town selling the butter churn. I bought my nails. I came home. I fed what needed feeding, and I sat down to supper, which was salt pork and cold biscuits left from that morning, and I ate it at the kitchen table alone as I had done for going on 6 years, and I did not think about Nora Alcott and her butter churn. Except that I did. Not in a soft way, not in any kind of romantic foolishness. It was more like a thing that had been done wrong bothered me the way a loose tooth bothers a man, not exactly pain, but a kind of persistent awareness you can't argue yourself out of. A woman selling her butter churn was a woman who'd run out of smaller things to sell. That was the math of it. The churn was what came last, because without it you couldn't make butter to trade, and without butter to trade you were down to the last of what you had. I knew that math. I'd watched my mother do it once years ago after my father died. Different time, different country, same arithmetic. The next morning I drove the wagon into Millhaven early, before the cold burned off, and I went to the general store. Frank Dilling was behind the counter, setting out tins. The churn was on the back shelf, tagged for sale at $4.50. I bought it. Frank wrapped it in burlap like I'd asked him to, and I drove back out to the broken axle, and I spent a solid hour arguing with myself about whether what I was planning to do next was the right thing or just a brand of stubbornness dressed up as decency. I decided it didn't much matter which one it was. I packed that churn with butter. I keep 3 dairy cows, always have, even when it seemed like more trouble than it was worth, because I like having butter and milk and I don't like buying what I can make. I churned that morning until I had as much as the churn would hold, good and fresh, salted the way Clara had taught me, which is to say salted correctly. Rinsed the outside of the ceramic, wiped it dry, rewrapped it in the burlap Frank had given me, and loaded it back in the wagon. 4 miles east. I'd been to the Alcott spread exactly once before, years back, about a property line question that turned out to be nothing. Small operation, neat enough. A house, a barn, some outbuildings. The sheep pens were back a ways. I remembered it being tidy, and now as I pulled up the lane I could see that someone must have been her alone, was working hard to keep it tidy still, though the effort was showing at the edges the way it does when there aren't enough hands. The fence nearest the road had a broken post that had been braced with a piece of lumber rather than replaced. The barn door hung a little wrong on its hinges. She came out of the house when she heard the wagon, wiped her hands on her apron, stood on the porch step. She looked at me the way people look at strangers on their property when they've learned to be careful, not hostile exactly, but measured, like she was calculating something. I set the brake and climbed down, and pulled the burlap-wrapped churn off the bed. "Mrs. Alcott," I said, "I'm Virgil Crane, I have the spread to the west." "I know who you are," she said. "I bought something of yours in town this morning." She went still, not angry, just very still, the way a person goes when they're deciding how to handle something they hadn't planned for. "I don't need charity," she said, quiet, clear. "It's not charity," I said. "Frank Dilling sells things at consignment and takes a cut. I bought it at the price you set, and I'm returning it." "That's not." "It's full of butter," I said. "Consider that the freight fee." I set it down at the foot of the porch steps and stepped back. She looked at the churn, she looked at me. "That makes no sense," she said. "Probably not," I agreed. "Enjoy the butter." I climbed back on the wagon, released the brake and drove home. I want to be honest about what I was doing, because I've thought about it enough since that I think I understand it. It wasn't pity, I don't think it was, or it wasn't only that. It was more that there is a particular kind of wrong in the world that happens quietly, with no one to make a scene about it, a decent person running out of road through no fault of their own, and there are some things a man with resources can do about that, and some he can't. Driving 4 miles and dropping off a butter churn was in the category of what I could do, so I did it. I didn't expect anything from it. What I got was a knock on my door 12 days later, on a cold Tuesday morning. She stood on my porch holding a cloth-covered plate. She'd come on horseback, that same gray I'd seen on the road, looking less exhausted than before. She wore a coat I didn't recognize, which meant she'd probably owned it before Dell died and hadn't bought anything since. "I brought you a pie," she said. "Apple. I had a late apple on one of the trees and I had the lard." "You didn't need to do that," I said. "You returned my churn full of butter," she said. I needed to do something. This is what I had. I looked at her, she looked at me. Well, I said, you want to come in out of the cold? I won't be long. I've got coffee on. A pause. All right, she said. She sat at my kitchen table, which no one had sat at across from me in a long time, and I poured 2 cups and set the pie on the counter and we talked. Or she talked some and I listened, which is more or less what I do. And then I talked a little and she listened, which seemed to surprise her, the way real attention surprises a person who isn't used to receiving it. She told me about the sheep operation and what it was and wasn't. The flock was down to 43 head, from almost 90 when Dell was alive. Some had died over the winter, some she'd sold to cover the spring costs, and now she was trying to decide whether to consolidate down to something she could manage alone or whether she needed to sell the whole thing and work out what came next. She said it matter-of-factly, the way practical people talk about hard situations. Like if she kept her voice level, the situation itself might agree to stay manageable. She asked about my spread and I told her a little. Not a lot. I'm not a man who explains himself easily to people he doesn't know. She drank the coffee and said it was good. I thanked her. Clara had taught me that too, the right grind, the right water, the right moment to pull it off the heat. She was on her feet and at the door in about 30 minutes, like she'd promised herself a limit and was keeping to it. Thank you, she said, for the butter and for the coffee. Thank you for the pie, I said. She nodded once and left. I ate the pie that evening. It was excellent. I don't know exactly when the arrangement began. It wasn't a thing either of us proposed. It was more like a series of practical steps, each one plain enough on its own, that added up to something over the weeks that followed. I knew a man in Millhaven who sold fence posts at a fair price, and I knew the Alcott spread needed some, and I happened to be driving through that way in late October anyway. I bought some extra and dropped them at her fence line on my way back. No ceremony. Just set them there with a note that said I had too many and she was welcome to them. She wrote back, a short note, left in my mailbox at the road, saying that if I had a moment in the next week or two, she would appreciate my opinion on the barn door hinges, as she had the hardware but wasn't certain she was reading the hang of the door correctly. I came out on a Saturday and looked at the hinges. They were wrong. Not badly wrong, but the door was weighted on the outside edge and needed to be shimmed at the top or it'd never close flush in winter. I fixed it. Took about an hour. She made lunch. We ate it on the porch because the day was clear and cold in a way that felt like a gift before the real winter arrived, and she asked me about my cattle and I asked her about the sheep, and she had opinions about both that were worth hearing. I went home and didn't think much about it, or told myself I didn't. November came in hard. That year it came in very hard, a cold front that swept down from the north in the first week of the month and didn't let up, temperatures dropping to places they shouldn't reach until January. I had my own problems. The roof patch on the barn that needed that third pass, and my remaining hand down with something that kept him in his bunk for 4 days, and a section of the north fence that had blown down in the wind and had to be reset before I lost cattle through the gap. I thought about the Alcott sheep in that cold. 43 head, 1 woman, a barn with hinges I'd fixed but a roof I hadn't looked at. I drove out on the 4th day of the cold, when my hand was back on his feet and the fence was reset and I had a day I could spare. Her barn roof had a problem. Not a catastrophic one, but a bad one. A section of shingles on the north face had been undermined by the cold, and she'd been packing the gap with old burlap, which works for about 20 minutes. The sheep were fine for now, but they wouldn't be in another week if it got worse. She came out and watched me look at it and said, "I know," in a tone that meant she'd already been lying awake about it. "I can fix it," I said. "I've got cedar shingles at the broken axle I cut last spring and never used." "I can't pay you." "I didn't ask about pay. I don't want to owe." You fixed my barn door hinges once, I said. We'll call it even. A lie, and we both knew it, but she let it stand. I drove back and loaded the shingles and came back and spent the rest of that day, and most of the next morning on her barn roof. She worked below, keeping the sheep moved and mucking out and doing the 1,000 other things a sheep operation demands in November. And in the early afternoon, she climbed a ladder with a tin cup of coffee and handed it up to me without a word and went back down. Hot coffee at the top of a barn roof in a north wind. I want to say that again. Hot coffee, handed up without being asked for, at exactly the moment it was needed. That's a thing a person notices. The roof was sound by the second day's end. I came down and she was in the barn, forking hay, and she looked up when I came in. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it, Virgil." First time she'd used my name. "You've got a good flock," I said, looking at the sheep. They were settled and warm now, moving the slow, easy way sheep move when they're not alarmed. Dell kept good stock. Something moved across her face at that. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, more like the complicated expression a person makes when they hear a true and decent thing said about someone they've lost. "He did," she said. I nodded and went home. December. By December it was clear enough, without either of us having said so, that we were looking out for each other's operations the way neighbors should but often don't. I was checking her fence line when I was near that side of my property anyway. She was sending word through the boy who ran errands in Millhaven when she heard something at the feed store or the hardware counter that I might want to know. I dropped a load of firewood in her yard one morning. I'd been splitting anyway, always split more than I need. It's one of those habits that settles a man's mind when the work is going wrong. And when I was unloading it, she came out and worked alongside me, stacking it under the lean-to, saying nothing much, just working. That was the first time I'd had someone working alongside me on my own property since Clara. I'm not going to pretend that didn't land. We didn't talk about Dell much, and she didn't ask about Clara. People who have lost know better than to pry at those things. But there was an understanding in the space between us that I think only people who have carried that particular weight know how to recognize. Like a key fitting a lock that isn't your own but fits anyway. She made supper for me once in December, at her place. A proper supper. Lamb stew with root vegetables, and cornbread that was the best I'd eaten since Clara's. I ate 2 portions, and she watched me eat with an expression that was something between satisfaction and amusement, like a woman who knows she's cooked something well and isn't going to pretend otherwise. "You haven't been eating enough," she said. "I eat fine." "You've lost weight since October." I looked at her. "You noticed that in October." "I noticed things," she said, and went back to her bowl. I didn't know what to do with that, so I did what I usually do with things I don't know how to handle. I let it sit. Christmas came and went. I brought her a wheel of cheese I'd gotten in Millhaven and a pair of good leather gloves because the ones she wore were cracking at the seams. She gave me a jar of cherry preserves and a muffler she'd knitted from her own wool, dark blue, heavy. The kind of muffler a man can put his whole face into and feel less alone in a cold morning. She said it was just wool she had, and the knitting gave her hands something to do in the evenings. I wore that muffler every morning for the rest of the winter. January brought more cold and a stretch of icy roads that made travel miserable, and I found myself riding over to check on her more often than I strictly needed to, more often, I'll say, than could be explained by neighborly obligation alone. And I noticed, without making a point of it to myself, that she seemed neither surprised nor displeased to see me when I came. She was managing, that was the word for it. She was a woman who knew how to manage hard things, and she did it without performing it for anyone. She got up every morning and did the work and went to sleep and got up the next day. But managing alone is different from managing. A man learns that. Takes some time, but a man learns it. One evening in late January, I rode over in a light snow to check that the north side of her barn roof was holding. There'd been an ice load building on it that I'd been watching from a distance with some concern. And by the time I'd satisfied myself that the shingles were holding, it was full dark and the snow had picked up. She wouldn't hear of me riding back in it, not at that hour, and to be honest the horse agreed with her, which settled the matter. I slept on her settle, under a quilt that smelled like cedar and lanolin, and in the morning she made breakfast, eggs and salt pork and biscuits, and coffee she made the same way I did, which surprised me enough that I said so. "My mother made it that way," she said. "I've never seen the reason to do it different." "Clara taught me," I said, first time I'd said her name to Nora. A pause that wasn't uncomfortable. "She taught you well," Nora said. I looked at her across the table. She was looking at her coffee. "Yes," I said, "she did." February. There's a particular quality to February on the plains, a tiredness, like even the cold has worn itself out and is only continuing from habit. Cattle stand with their heads down. The light is thin. Men who got through January on determination alone start to feel the seams. I've been having trouble with my shoulder that month. Old injury, took a horse on my shoulder when I was 32 and it healed wrong, and every cold season it reminded me that it had healed wrong. I didn't make much of it, didn't mention it to anyone. Nora noticed anyway. Noticed the way I was holding my right arm when I climbed down from the wagon one afternoon, and the way I wasn't lifting with it the way I usually did. She didn't say anything that day. She said something 3 days later when I came by for a different reason, and she sat me down in her kitchen and without quite asking permission, put both her hands on my shoulder and felt where the trouble was. Her hands were warm and sure. She wasn't a healer exactly. She didn't claim to be, but her mother had known things, she said, about muscle and bone and heat, and she'd learned some of it by watching. She worked on it for a while, quiet and focused, and I sat still and let her, which is not something I do easily, and when she was done the shoulder was better than it had been in 3 weeks. "You should have said something," she said. "I manage," I said. "I know you manage," she said. "That's not the point." She was standing close, her hand still near my shoulder, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in a long time. Not pity, not the careful measurement of the first day on the porch. Something else. Something that looked like she'd been thinking about something for a while and had arrived somewhere and wasn't sure yet what to do about it. "Virgil," she said. "Nora," I said. We stood there like two people at a door, neither one of us entirely sure who should open it. She put one hand on my jaw, just that, her palm against my jaw, her thumb near the corner of my mouth, looking at me the way a woman looks at a man when she's decided something. "You've been out here every week since October," she said. "Fence posts and roof shingles and firewood. You bought my churn back and sent it home full of butter. You sleep on my settle in snowstorms and pretend it's only about the roof." The roof was a genuine concern. "Virgil." "Yes," I said. "I see what you've been doing," she said, "and I see why. And I want you to know that I'm not a woman who's going to stand out here and keep pretending I don't know what this is." I covered her hand with mine, there against my jaw. "What is it?" I said quietly. "I think," she said, "that you've been keeping me from going under since October, and I've been letting you because I'm not a fool, and because you're the best man I've met in a long time, and I think it's time we stopped calling it neighborly obligation." I looked at her face, the gray coming in at the front of her hair, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting into weather, the set of her jaw that I'd first seen on the road in October and had not forgotten. "All right," I said, slow. She kept her hand on my jaw a moment longer. Then she pulled it back and went to the stove to see about the coffee, and I sat at her table and breathed out slow and let the thing settle in my chest the way a right thing settles when a man's been holding space for it without knowing it. March brought mud and then some warmth, and by March it was as plain as the weather that whatever had been building between us had built. She kept her own operation and I kept mine, which was what made sense and what she wanted, and I wouldn't have had it different. She wasn't a woman who needed to be absorbed by someone. She was a woman who needed a man beside her who understood what she was doing and respected the doing of it. I like to think I gave her that. What she gave me is harder to put words to. I had been alone in this particular way for 6 years. Not lonesome, exactly, or not always, but empty. There's a kind of empty that comes from being competent and steady and getting things done and having no one in particular who knows it. Like work that falls in the dark. You know you did it, but you do it and you put it away, and the next day you get up and do more of it, and the knowing stays only with you. Nora knew it. She watched me work, and she understood what she was watching. She'd been married to a working man, and she knew what good work looked like, and she didn't fail to say so when she saw it. She'd hand up that coffee at the top of the barn roof. She'd sit across the table and eat, and tell me I'd lost weight and look at me in a way that meant she'd been keeping track. She'd put her hands on my shoulder without asking and fix the thing that I'd been quietly suffering with for 3 weeks. She'd say plainly what I was to her, standing in her kitchen in February, and she wouldn't dress it up or make it soft or wait for me to go first. That's a particular kind of gift. A woman who sees you clear and says it plainly and means it. Some men never get that. Some men get it and don't recognize it until it's too late. I was old enough to know what I was looking at. On a Thursday in late March, I drove out to her place in the morning, and we walked the full perimeter of her sheep pasture together, checking fence, noting what needed to be done in the spring. She had a good eye for the land, knew where it drained poorly, knew where a post was leaning before I'd spotted it, knew the names and temperaments of individual sheep in the flock in a way that would have seemed excessive to some people, and seemed entirely right to me. She talked about what she wanted to do with the operation if she could get the flock back to 60 head by next summer. She had a plan, not a vague hope, a plan, with numbers and timing and the knowledge of what each piece depended on. I listened. I asked questions where I had them. We went back to the house and ate lunch, and I told her what I thought she had right and what I thought she might want to reconsider, and she listened and pushed back on 2 points and was right to push back on them. It was the best afternoon I'd had in years. When it was time for me to go, she walked out with me to the wagon. The afternoon was clear, with that sharp low light that March makes, cutting across the land at an angle. She stood beside me at the wagon while I checked the harness, and then I turned to her. She stepped close, put both arms around me and pressed her forehead to my collarbone and stayed there for a moment, her arms around my ribs, her weight against mine. I put my arms around her. She was warm and solid and real, and the land was quiet around us, and the light was going golden across the pasture behind her. I held her. She let herself be held, which I came to understand was not a thing she did easily. "You come back Saturday," she said, into my coat. "I'll come back Saturday," I said. She stepped back, looked at me once with those clear dark eyes and no performance in them at all. "Good," she said, and went back inside. I drove home in that low March light, and I didn't think about much. I don't do my best thinking in moments like that. What I mostly did was watch the road and let what had happened be true without putting a lot of words around it. There's a thing that happens to a man when he's been running on obligation and habit and pure working endurance for a long time, and then something changes, something comes into his life that makes the work matter in a different direction. It doesn't make him soft. That's not what I'm saying. If anything, it makes a man stand up straighter, do the job better, put the effort in more cleanly, because the effort means something now that it didn't mean the day before. I came back Saturday, and the Saturday after that. By summer we'd worked out, without a lot of ceremony, that the most practical arrangement was for me to spend more of my time on her side of the fence line. Not because I was moving in, exactly. We hadn't talked about that yet, and we were both the kind of people who let arrangements find their own level before we named them. But because her operation needed steady hands and mine could be stretched a little, and because practical arrangements have a way of becoming what they actually are if you give them enough time, I got her flock back to 63 head by August. She did most of the work. I'm not going to take credit for the lamb survival rates or the pasture rotation she worked out or the deal she negotiated with a buyer in Millhaven that got her 17 cents a pound when most operations in the county were getting 14. That was her. I helped where I could. I fixed what broke. I kept watch when she couldn't. And every morning when I got up and looked out at the land, which I'd been looking at it alone for 6 years, there was now a lamp in the window of the house across the east fence. Lit before mine was, usually, because she was a woman who started early. Sometimes, if the morning was particularly good, I'd see a figure moving on the porch and I'd know she was watching the same light come up over the same piece of sky, and whatever that meant, whatever word you want to put on it, it was enough. It was more than enough. I'm telling you this in the winter now. 4 years on from that October morning, when I watched a woman drive a butter churn toward town with a horse that was doing its best and a back that wouldn't bend. The barn roof is solid. The flock is at 81 head, which is more than Dell had when he was living, and Nora will tell you she's not finished. The gray horse passed in the second winter, and she cried for 2 days, and then went to a stockman south of Millhaven and came back with a bay gelding that has a better temperament and another decade of work in him. The broken axle is still mine, but I'm over here more than I'm over there. And my hand manages the broken axles day to day, with the kind of competence that makes a man feel all right about loosening his grip on things. We got married in the spring of the second year. Courthouse in Millhaven, 2 witnesses, supper at her table that evening. She wore a dress the color of the sky right after a storm when it goes that particular shade of pale that's almost white, and she looked at me across that small courtroom with the same level clear expression she'd had on her porch the first day, measuring, certain, not performing anything for anyone, and I thought, as I had thought before and have thought since, this is a woman who knows what she's doing and is not uncertain about it. That matters to a man more than most things. I was 59 when she drove that wagon past my fence line. I'm 63 now. My shoulder still gives me trouble in February, and she still puts her hands on it and fixes it without being asked, because she knows by now when it's bothering me before I say so. I still make the coffee the right way. She still has opinions about the sheep and the cattle and the market and anything else worth having an opinion about, and she's right often enough that I've learned to listen before I talk. The other day she came in from the pasture in the late afternoon, wind burned, hay on her coat, boots carrying 3 counties of mud, and she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me across the room where I was mending a piece of harness, and she said, "I never thanked you properly for the butter." I looked up at her. "I believe you made a pie," I said. "That was apple," she said. "That wasn't enough. It was a very good pie." "Virgil." "Nora." She got up and came and stood behind me and put her arms around me from behind and pressed her cheek to the top of my head, which she does sometimes when words aren't quite what she's after, and I put one hand up over her forearm and held it there. Outside the window the land was going dark in the way it does in winter, that quick violet dark that comes in fast on the short days, and the lamp was lit, and the harness was half mended, and somewhere out in the pasture 81 sheep were doing what sheep do when they're warm and fed, and tended by someone who knows how. I held her arm. She held me. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole thing.